That siege was criminal behavior, plain and simple, and it's behavior that we, the FBI, view as domestic terrorism.
The threat of domestic extremism is one of the greatest challenges that the Department of Homeland Security confronts, and it has unique capabilities in confronting that challenge.
As Congress debates the mandate of a commission to investigate the storming of the U.S. Capitol, the Biden administration vows to make the fight against domestic terrorism a top priority. Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. Republican leaders are objecting to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's draft mandate of a commission to look into the January 6th insurrection on Capitol Hill. Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell called Pelosi's idea of setting up a 9/11-style commission, quote, partisan by design, and said the commission should be equally composed of Democrats and Republicans. Pelosi's plan provides for 7 Democratic and 4 Republican commissioners. McConnell also argued that in looking at violent extremism, the Commission should examine, quote, the full scope of the political violence problem in this country, a thinly veiled reference to the nationwide Black Lives Matter protests last summer. So far, over 280 people have been arrested and charged in connection with the failed insurrection. Joining me now to discuss that and the threat of domestic extremism is Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. She's also the whip of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and vice chair of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa. Congresswoman Omar, it's great to have you on the program. When you look back on your experience on the 6th of January, what was it like for you to be at the Capitol, and how hopeful are you that the 9/11-style commission will uncover important new information about how a security breach like this could have happened?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's really great to be here with you today. The events on January 6th really were just traumatic and unexpected. You know, I remember getting ready that day and arriving at the Capitol. I'd had an increase in death threats, so I had security with me, guiding me for the day and protecting me for the day. And I remember going out into the balcony of my office to look down on the Capitol and seeing the mob sort of gathered around the Capitol. And I realized that there was not a lot of police presence. There was no National Guard. And then from the security guards that were with me, I could hear on their radios that there were pipe bombs that were being founded, and there were people being evacuated in different buildings, and that there was possibility of snipers. And I realized that even with security, I might not be, kept safe with, if pipe bombs went off or the snipers were successful. So I started to worry about my own safety beyond the security that I had. And I remember texting the father of my children and saying, if I don't make it out today, please tell my children that I love them. And it was completely terrifying as someone who has survived political violence and a civil war, knowing that, things could escalate and we might be in more danger than it was being perceived, was traumatic and triggering for me. I do hope that the commission that we will form uncovers really what led to the events of January 6th and how an insurrection of that size could be implemented against the government of the United States, and there be recommendations for, extra security measures that need to be taken to protect our Capitol, but also for there to be accountability for those who have brainwashed, radicalized, aided and abetted those who took part in the insurrection and the rebellion against our government.
But knowing what you do about the way things tend to work on Capitol Hill, do you believe that we will indeed get to the bottom of what happened? Several of your colleagues in the House say they believe that some lawmakers may have collaborated with the insurgents. Some are talking about a conspiracy. Do you believe there was coordination between the violent mobs and some members of Congress? And if so, what should happen?
Yeah, I think there has been indications that members of Congress were involved in inciting the insurrection. There are indications that members of Congress were aiding and abetting the insurrectionists and helped with the rebellion against our government. Yes, things don't perfectly work in Congress, especially with the divisions that currently exist and the conflicts that we are seeing between the two parties. But I am confident that we will get to the bottom of this and people will be held accountable, and that we will, get ourselves to a position where we can move forward as a nation and as members of Congress collectively together.
You wrote recently, in the aftermath of the failed insurrection, that you, quote, never expected to experience a direct assault on democracy in the United States. But if there's any lesson we can draw from the past 4 years, it is that it can happen here. How does your own personal experience growing up in Somalia, a country that descended into civil war virtually overnight, make you look at what is going on in the United States today?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes we say, like you just said, country like Somalia, had a civil war overnight, but that isn't actually the reality, right? That civil war was in the making for nearly a decade or more, and society and leaders and so many people looked the other way and could not fathom that their country and their lives would be destroyed one day. So they didn't plan for it. They didn't do anything to protect it from happening. And my fear is that has kind of been the situation here in the United States, not just the last 4 years, but the last 12 years. We have sort of seen the writing on the wall for what would eventually take place on January 6th. And so many people decided to not do anything about, elements of our society that were radicalizing people, and didn't do anything about the political rhetoric that was getting violent. They didn't do anything about a lawless president. They didn't do anything about, the actions that were being taken the 6 months prior to the election, or the 3 weeks prior to the event on January 6th. And so, my worry is that the same people who said, nothing bad could ever happen here, are still in that position, and things will eventually get worse, and we might one day wake up to a country that we no longer recognize, like I did when I was 8.
And you mentioned a lawless president. You were the target of many attacks from President Trump, who falsely accused you on some occasions of praising al-Qaeda attacks on the United States, among many other things. You said you saw an increase in death threats after that, and certainly you've also faced a lot of intimidation and harassment after you became one of only 2 Muslim women ever elected to the US Congress, the other being your Democratic colleague, Rashida Tlaib. A Republican member of the House, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has openly supported the QAnon conspiracy movement, objected to your swearing an oath to the Constitution on a Quran rather than the Bible. She said that did not make you quite as official as it should have been. She ran a campaign ad holding an assault rifle pointed at you and Congresswomen Tlaib and Ocasio-Cortez as she ran for Congress. What impact did this have on you? And do you think the Democratic leadership in the House took it seriously enough?
Yeah, I mean, the level of ignorance and bigotry that exists to have allowed someone like this violent, hateful, conspiracy theorist to get elected to Congress should be alarming for everyone, not just those of us who have been the subjects of her hate. And to many of our colleagues, I think the seriousness of the death threats that we get, how our lives have been turned upside down by our desire to help our country achieve progress, really isn't something that is fully understood. I was proud of Majority Leader Hoyer when he stood up and talked about, how it was not just unbecoming of a colleague to have threatened us, but unbecoming of our country to have someone to run a campaign ad holding assault rifle to our heads, essentially, threatening our lives and the impact that would have on our families and our children. That's a really good step, and I hope that more people are vocal about the actual threats that we face and how their silence is complacency and will continue to endanger our lives.
But what do you think will it take to address and defeat these forces of white supremacy and white power that we have seen grow increasingly strong and open in the last couple of years?
So I think three things are going to need to happen simultaneously. One, we have to take it seriously. We have to understand that we have a problem. And second, we have to address radicalization and those who are radicalizing these white supremacists to become violent. And third, we have to apply the laws that we have on the books equally and adequately in holding these people accountable.
Do you feel, though, that the US is at an inflection point now, that it could go either way? You've spoken about the fact that what we've seen happen recently could lead us down a path of violent revolution, democratic breakdown, or the opposite. Which path do you think the US will take, given what is going on around us?
I mean, my worry is that we are headed towards a path of democratic backsliding. We are headed towards a path of normalized political violence. We are headed a path towards homegrown domestic terrorism and really denigration of our societal norms and traditions. And I feel like there's few of us who seem to be alarmed by that reality, and the rest are, treating it as if this is just politics. The Democrats, the Republicans, fighting over policy and not, something more sinister and dangerous that is brewing and, will eventually bubble up in ways that we might not be able to control.
How difficult do you think Joe Biden and the Democrats, how difficult a job will they have in uniting Americans who you yourself said recently no longer share the same basic reality?
I mean, we have to be clear about our call for unity, that there isn't really unity that could be had without accountability. You cannot, confuse the desire to unify people who are politically disconnected, to unifying people who are violently trying to eliminate your existence and your ability to govern.
Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, such a pleasure to have you on the program. I know how busy you are. Thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, thank you.
You can watch the full interview with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, where we also discuss her leadership role on a key House Foreign Affairs subcommittee and Biden's foreign policy challenges at trtworld.com.
We won the election twice. I mean, think about it. I will tell you something, and I said it. Had we had a fair election, the results would have been much different.
In his first speech since leaving the White House, Donald Trump still refused to accept defeat, claiming again that the election was stolen. Trump spoke at the Conservative Political Action Conference in Florida, which included some members of Congress and others who believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory, and that the legitimate president, Donald Trump, will be inaugurated on March 4th, the date when US presidents were inaugurated before 1937. As 5,000 National Guards remain deployed around the Capitol to ward off any possible violence, Biden's pick for Attorney General, Merrick Garland, told the Senate Judiciary Committee that he will do everything in the power of the Justice Department to stop domestic violent extremism. He added that the January 6th events were linked to a movement that poses an existential threat to the United States. Garland was the lead federal prosecutor in the Oklahoma City bombing case in 1995, considered the deadliest act of recent domestic terrorism in the U.S. For more on the threat of violent extremism in the U.S., I'm joined by Michael Jensen, senior researcher at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. Michael Jensen, obviously the event of January 6th came as a shock to many. As someone who studied these movements, did it come as a surprise to you?
Unfortunately, no. While January 6th was an extraordinary event, something that we don't see very often in this country or in other advanced democracies, myself and my colleagues that study this have been warning for several months that something like this could occur.
And now the National Guard is bracing for another event, March 4th, a protest movement where so-called sovereign citizens and QAnon supporters would converge on Washington, D.C. How much coordination is there among these groups? Do they share a political platform? Do they act in unison? Or are they actually independent from each other?
They're independent of each other, but they share some similarities, and they certainly have a common enemy. So they are both quite concerned about liberal politicians, liberal elites, and their policies, and they organize around that common enemy. March 4th has been selected out of a somewhat convoluted belief that Donald Trump will reemerge on the 4th and be inaugurated as the 19th president of the United States. It's rooted in conspiracy theory that has no fact or evidence behind it, but we see that these groups are beginning to collaborate more and more often around these conspiratorial narratives.
What kind of people end up joining these groups, the QAnons, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and so many other groups like this?
You know, the most common characteristic is really their diversity. There are so many different types of people that get attracted to these movements. Some individuals come from affluent backgrounds, have good educations, good families, but perhaps there's something in their life that they feel is missing. Perhaps it's a sense of adventure or excitement, and that's what draws them into the movement. Other people have experiences of trauma and abuse in their background, and those act as triggers that lead them into the movement. So it's really a wide variety of backgrounds. We have young people, we have old people, rich people, less economically advanced individuals, educated, uneducated, you name it, you can find adherents across the spectrum.
And you wrote earlier this month that the January 6th events go beyond one insurrection. This is mass radicalization. How much more difficult will it be for law enforcement agencies now to track down these groups since they've been kicked off mainstream social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook?
Well, on the one hand, they have a volume problem. We have potentially millions of people who have radicalized to believe conspiracy theories, claims about election fraud, and have been recruited into organizations that do try to mobilize their members to violence. So the FBI and other law enforcement agencies potentially have a lot of individuals that they have to investigate and keep track of. The other issue that they face now is as they've been removed from Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and the mainstream platforms and moved onto these smaller platforms like Gab and Parler and Telegram, they're a bit harder to track. These platforms allow for anonymous forms of communication. They're encrypted end to end, and so it will be more difficult for law enforcement to figure out who is behind the posts.
But the FBI and law enforcement have been warning for years about the infiltration of white supremacists, of police departments and other law enforcement agencies in the US. How serious a problem is it? And what about the US military? Are we talking about just a few bad apples, or is the problem more organic, more systemic, and much more widespread?
I think it is important to note that in the force of almost 2 million individuals in the United States Armed Forces, that we are talking about a very, very small percentage of individuals that have aligned themselves with extremist movements or groups. With that said, if even one person violates their sworn oath to protect the country against foreign and domestic threats and instead chooses to become the threat, then there is a problem. The U.S. military is not new to these problems. In the 1990s, they addressed these issues after the Oklahoma City bombing and after a high-profile hate crime that occurred in North Carolina. They took some steps to try to weed out extremism. It didn't work completely, and over the last few years, we've seen an increase in extremist activity amongst former military members. A project that I work on estimates that about 15% of individuals that have been arrested for extremist crimes in the last several decades had military backgrounds.
Why are people with military background and training particularly susceptible to recruitment by these groups?
It could be a number of reasons. One is that the groups find them very attractive as members. They bring a set of tactical and operational skills to the group that otherwise they wouldn't have. These individuals know weapons, they know tactical maneuvering. These are skills that the groups find very appealing, so they make an effort to recruit these individuals. Another reason why they might be attractive is that perhaps their transition back to civilian life hasn't been as fulfilling or rewarding as they hoped it would be. Individuals who join the military usually have a certain set of leadership qualities. They want to be revered in their communities. They want to be leaders. And when they can't find that fulfillment in civilian life, they are promised it in extremist groups, and they might find that appealing.
Do you think these groups should be designated as domestic terrorist organizations? Nancy Pelosi referred to the events of January 6th as a domestic terrorist attack. The new head of the Department of Homeland Security said for several years the United States has been suffering an upsurge in domestic violent extremism. I have designated domestic violent extremism as a national priority area for the first time. Does it matter how we refer to these groups and the acts they commit?
It does make a difference, especially in terms of the legal authorities we have to prosecute the cases. So without a domestic terrorism statute, prosecutors are somewhat restricted in what they can charge individuals with. They often get charged with things like firearms violations, drug violations, things like that. There is no domestic terrorism charge. So what that means is that a lot of the tools that they use to investigate international terrorism cannot be used in domestic terrorist cases. So the language does matter.
What about the financing that is associated with tackling this issue? Attacks by far-right extremists more than quadrupled between 2016 and 2017. Yet the operating budget of the Homeland Security Department tasked with investigating domestic extremism and terrorism was actually cut from $21 million to less than $3 million in the last couple of years. Yeah. How much more investment should the administration make if it is serious about tackling this issue?
It's going to have to make a really significant investment in tackling this issue. So we need to get back to at least the levels that were being spent during the Obama administration, when not only was more being spent on law enforcement initiatives to identify these individuals and arrest those that were involved in criminal activity, but also there was a real effort to get community programming in place to help vulnerable individuals who might be at risk of radicalizing. So this is going to take a significant influx of resources.
All right, Michael Jensen, thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insights. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And so while the threat of domestic violence and terrorism isn't new, the FBI had warned 15 years ago that white supremacists had infiltrated police departments, calling it a threat to national security. What is raising concerns for many here in the United States is why the overt threat the Capitol insurgents represented and clearly articulated on social media wasn't taken seriously, given how vocal far-right and white supremacist groups had been during Trump's presidency. While of course they predate Trump, These groups have gained political significance lately as they seem to have found some echo chambers within the Republican Party. The Biden administration's plan to allocate $77 million to ward off homegrown terrorism is probably a token effort. And yet, Republicans disagree over which groups law enforcement agencies should focus on, despite FBI data that white supremacists have been responsible for more American deaths and thus represent the gravest danger. And so, in short, after systemic racism and violence were ignored for so long, combating domestic extremism and terrorism hinges on how determined the new administration, the police, and the courts will be in tackling the now obvious and clearly identified threats, the specter of white supremacy in particular. As the first Black US president, Obama largely avoided the topic. President Biden now cannot ignore it. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, for this week. From the entire team here in Washington, thank you for watching.